I did an amazing funeral for someone who was very young. He was a pioneer in the skateboard park. And so we did this thing, when you have, I think it would be an army thing, where they get the rifles and they make like an archway. And they all brought their skateboards and they all put their skateboards together as an archway. And then we carried his coffin through the archway. My sister was 62 and she was dying. This was in 2013. And she had a daughter who fell in love, and my sister was a hopeless romantic. And she had this grand piano, which was actually my grandmother's. And on it, she had, I don't know, maybe 50 or 60 wedding photographs, and they were all big white weddings, church weddings, meringues, the lot. But her daughter was really quite low-key, quite subtle, and wanted to elope and get married, just her and her now husband. But my sister was a massive force of nature, and she really wanted to have the big wedding for her daughter. So there's this kind of clash of generations and ideas about how they wanted to do things. And so they decided to ask me to do the wedding. And at the time I was planning to be a church priest, so a priest in the Church of England. And I'd spent quite a lot of time and energy trying to be that person, which you can probably tell I'm not, which we learned that in the end. And the way that I learned that the church really wasn't for me was when I did this wedding for my niece. So she called me, I think probably because I had this connection with church and I was good at speaking from the front and I knew a lot about services. She called me and said, look, it's got to be you. And she did swear, I have to say, but I'll keep it off camera, protect her dignity. But she did call me and say, look, if I've got to have this wedding, it's got to be you. And so I went and trained to become what I now know is called a celebrant. And that's really someone that does a celebration for a wedding or a funeral that isn't necessarily legal, but it's personal and individual for you. So we made this unique ceremony, and it was in Portugal, and that's how I ended up looking over the beach and celebrating with all of my family and my sister maybe a few months before she died. So it was magical, incredible memories, and I just was completely sold on doing that for people and realised that's what I was in the world for. And yes, they are non-religious, but I'm actually not humanist. So if you had a humanist here, you would be talking to someone who's signed up to the Humanists UK, and they are people who are completely non-religious and very kind of explicitly signing to say that they're not religious. And I'm not like that. I've had too many experiences in church and too many conversations with spiritual people. I studied theology and religion, so I just could never quite sign up to saying there's nothing. I just kind of hold on to the hope that there's something. So I am able to do spiritual things, not summoning ghosts or anything like that, but I'm able to do prayers or poems with the word God in, which humanists aren't really supposed to do. I do weddings. Those weddings can be anything really. This is super exciting. On Saturday, in a redwood forest in Sussex, in this beautiful, beautiful woodland, like a fairy tale woodland, something out of a movie, I did my first polyamorous wedding, and I am very excited about the future of that. Ceremonies for polyamory is, I think, going to become a thing. It's not yet a legal thing, and there will be all sorts of conversations around that coming up. So that's a good example of a quite unusual service. I do funeral ceremonies for people where they might come in on a flatbed truck, which is like an open lorry, and the coffin is put onto the flatbed truck. I can't say that very easily. Flatbed truck, and brought in. Or you can have anything. I did once do a funeral for the Devil's Own motorcycle club. So I'm there in my little suit, looking very white, middle class and liberal. And these people turned up. There's a cavalcade of motorbikes, these huge Harley Davidsons, and they all came in, with their rabbit tails and their leathers, and they loved me. And they said, oh, well, of course, you know that you're a witch. And I was like, no, I didn't know I was a witch, but thank you for letting me know that I'm a witch. So you do get a lot of people will project onto you what they think you are or what they need you to be. And I was like properly flattered that they thought I was a witch, but as far as I'm aware, I'm not. So I did an amazing funeral for someone who was very young. He was a pioneer in the skateboard park area of the world, that arena, skateboarding, and he was very loved locally in Birmingham. And so we did this thing, when you have armies, I think it would be an army thing, where they get the rifles and they make like an archway. And we did that with all the skateboarders, and they all brought their skateboards and they all put their skateboards together as an archway, and then we carried his coffin through the archway. Your traditional funeral, anyone who's watching this in the UK will know what I'm talking about when I say 20 minutes down the creme. So I don't know where you're watching in the world, but in the UK, 20 minutes down the creme is usually a quite soulless building. Quite often it's where grandma was taken for cremation, and it's where granddad went, and then you want to go there because that's where the family crematorium is. Occasionally they're really, really nice buildings, but in the main they're quite depressing and grey and a little bit soulless, but they don't have to be religious. What's weird is that they're kind of designed around churches, but they're not, they don't serve a religious function, so they kind of don't have anything nice about them that you might find in a church. But you would go there and you would have 20 minutes start to finish. So you are brought in maybe with usually men in frock coats, like old-fashioned coats and top hats, like you'd see in a Victorian, like Dickensian sort of look. And they have these sticks and they march in, and it's all very, very sort of serious and very somber. And then you would have usually someone like me standing at the front, usually a priest, and they would say, welcome. And then you would have a song, quite often a hymn that no one's ever heard of. And then you would have some words, and then someone like me might do a little speech about them, or the priest would say a speech about them. Then you'd have another hymn that no one's ever heard. And then you'd have a poem, and it might be "Do Not Stand at My Grave and Weep." And then you'd have another song that no one's ever heard, and then you'd all go home. And you'd have just before that, you'd have a commendation, which is based on a religious rite where you commend the body to the earth. But obviously in a cremation setting, the body is then taken behind the curtain and into the back of the crematorium. I increasingly find that people don't want the curtain at the end. And there's this real shift to not wanting to have any kind of finality. So you might go and touch the coffin and then leave, but you leave the coffin in situ. So that would be your crematorium, and the church would probably be the same, but just a bit more religious. And often in the creme, you'll have My Way by Frank Sinatra, and you'll have the Lord's Prayer, or you might have Amazing Grace. And those are the more traditional, more typical stuff that if you're my kind of generation, you would be quite familiar with. So I'm in my early 50s, and now people of my generation are obviously starting to die. And did you know what's it called? Sniper Alley. So if you're my age and you're between, I hate telling you this, but it's a fact. If you're aged between 50 and 60, you're more likely to die during those 10 years than if you get past 60. So if you get past 60, you're more likely to live to 85 or 90. But if you don't get past that 10 years, you're done for. Anyway, I do a lot of funerals for people in their 50s, and they quite often have ABBA, and they'll have Dancing Queen, and everyone will be told not to wear black. So these are the slightly less traditional ones where you're still in the crematorium. You're still probably having music. So it's what's called a hymn sandwich. So you have music, prayer, music, story, music. Like it's just that hymn sandwich. But now they'll have maybe someone will have a bit of a sense of humour, and they'll have Ring of Fire at the end, or you'll have someone there's all kinds of really, really inappropriate things that people choose. And then there's all the disco music, and I've had them where they've played dub music at the end, and it's all been very rave. And why is it changing? Because society's changing, because the people who are now dying lived through the 60s. Let's say you take all your rock stars, you've got people in their 80s now who were the Rolling Stones then. So they're not going to go with tradition. They were anarchistic people. And if you've lived through the 60s, you've got this really much more open-minded, colourful, maybe a bit hippie kind of way of looking at the world. So because those people are now dying and their children are organising the funerals, they're not organising bleak East Ender funerals for someone that was basically a rock star. It just doesn't make sense. So COVID changed the landscape of funerals forever. Funerals fell out of fashion after COVID. When COVID happened, people like me were saying, this is dreadful. You were all saying it, weren't you? You were all at home saying, this is dreadful. What are we going to do? We can't bury our dead. And I was going to crematoria and I had bouncers on the door and I had people, maybe 6 people sat with masks on looking at me, and you could just see their tears coming down behind their masks. No one could touch each other. Many of you here and any of you watching will have had your own COVID death story. Everyone has one, everyone's heard one. And it was really at the time everyone was saying, maybe at the end of all this, people will have celebrations for their people to make up for what they've lost. And it felt almost sacrilegious or some kind of violation of a moral code that you couldn't bury people and that you couldn't have a ceremony for them. Because when you think about it, you've got our heritage is hundreds and hundreds of years of burying people being something associated with dignity and with status. So if you had the tomb of the unknown soldier, that was a thing of great tragedy. And all the graves that are marked everywhere across let's say France, you've got all those amazing memorials. They're there because they are honouring the dead, and we all have a very strong sense of that in the UK, that we must bury our dead, we must honour our dead, we must remember them, name them, everyone should witness that life. So that was something that we all thought was entrenched in our culture, until COVID taught us that we don't have to do that anymore. So all the people that were saying it's terrible, we don't have to have, we can't have a funeral, that has turned into, isn't it brilliant? We don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to have funerals anymore. Let's not bother. And that is the key change and the shift in culture around funerals, with COVID particularly. But there's also another really, really strong factor, which is the economic situation that we're in, and funeral poverty and budgetary concerns.
Hi, and welcome to Deep.
We're a brand new channel from the team behind such shows as
Agree to Disagree, Minutes With in the Gap, to name a few.
And now we've launched this new channel to keep telling stories.
And we'd love to hear what you think. So if there's a particular person you want to hear from, a particular theme that you want us to cover, please drop us a comment, and also like and subscribe for more.
We really hope you're enjoying the channel, and if you are, we've just launched a brand new Patreon account with all sorts of extra content.
Early access, extra videos, behind the scenes clips, and even merch. If that sounds good to you, then check out the link in our description.
Thank you, hit that subscribe button, and now back to our story.
I think I would start by describing my work process as a little bit like gathering information for a biography. So all my people are animal lovers, so there's always a pet. And obviously, because we're in the UK, we all drink tea. So I go round and you put the kettle on. Let's say you are my person. Okay, I'm talking to you now as if you are my person. God forbid you need me, but let's say you did. So I would say, oh, hi, it's Jess. Let's make an arrangement, or I'll come round and see you. And I come to your kitchen and you put the kettle on. And then the dog gets on my lap. And then I meet the cat. And then I meet the grandchildren. And then you get the photo albums out on your kitchen table. Okay, so that's the scene. And then you've got all of these albums of all of us in the 70s looking dreadful the way we were, with our haircuts that our parents gave us, and all these wonderful dungarees that are now all back in fashion, and they're faded photographs and they're nostalgic and they're beautiful. And as you show me those photographs, you will be saying to your brother or your sister or your loved one, whoever is in that room around that table, and they'll all have some relationship to the person who died. Or let's say, like, this is for when I'm dealing with people who have died. And what I need you to understand is that actually the process is the same for someone when they're alive. So you would then just talk about, do you remember when? And let's say you are the person who's having a living funeral, or let's call it a celebration of life while you're living. Do you remember when we went on that caravan to Whitby? Do you remember when we went to Tenby in Wales that summer and it did nothing but rain? Or that Christmas in 1998 when we were snowed in? Do you remember the way Nan used to twerk and she was 85? Like, these are real conversations that I have. And doing that with someone when they've died is amazing for the family. And I have no doubt that funerals are really important and healing for people. So having those conversations around your kitchen table when someone has died is super valuable. Never, ever forget it. It's so important. And the process is so important. But let's say that you haven't died yet and you know that you are. How amazing for you if you can sit around that table and eat your club biscuits and have your cup of tea with your dog and tell the story about how you found the dog, how that dog ended up in your life, about how you met the person you loved most in all of your life, about how, you know, all of the things that happened, all those crazy nights out, all the silly things that happened in that nightclub and all the crazy mad stuff that you never thought you'd share with a stranger. Trust me, you'll share it with me. So those things you can do. So that's the process for gathering a story when someone's died, or just gathering a story before you've died. But you can then, from that, you can extrapolate all the things that mattered most to you. Let's say it's champagne, and let's say it's, I don't know, give me something, chocolate cake and ABBA. No, we've done ABBA. Let's think of something else that you might love.
Beach holiday.
Beach holidays. Beach holidays is really good. So then you're thinking, well, if I had so you can either have this conversation with me in advance and then create a living funeral from this conversation. And I would recommend it because I then will go away and write your story. Or we can do it on the day itself and we can have these conversations whilst we're having a picnic or having a big rave or a party, whatever you want to do. But let's say that you told me that beach holidays were your thing. You'd been to Goa when you were 25 and it's always just guided your whole life. All of that practice, all of those spiritualities really mattered to you, and beaches were where you really found your soul was at peace. Then we would devise a living ceremony for you on a beach. You don't have to have a hymn sandwich. You can have a sandcastle party with sparklers, preferably. Living funerals are really, really new for me, so I don't have a great deal to draw from. They're mostly, mostly I've done really, really creative funerals. There's one that you will have seen in the public in particular that I think is really standout. Mine are quite low key. So the one I'm doing tomorrow is for someone who is losing her memory. Her daughter met me because we were working together and then persuaded her brother to maybe think about having a living funeral for mum. But mum's actually not dying, she's losing her memory. And so for them, it was really important to gather her story. And we're just going to gather for really quite a short period of time because her concentration is quite poor and she's becoming more poorly. And then I'm going to go away, we're going to meet afterwards and collate all of these stories. And then I'm going to go away and write them a keepsake book, which they can then use wherever they like at any point. So they can use it for a funeral, or maybe they might have a direct cremation and they'll use it for that. But they're really, really low key. So in a way, like, they're not the most, the ones I've done so far haven't been the most exciting. The one that viewers will be most familiar with is Chris Helenga, who had, there was a documentary about her quite recently. And she had a big old party with Dawn French there as the vicar of Dibley, and it was all rainbows and glitter and sparkles. I suspect that, well, the younger generation are much more into living funerals than the older ones, or my generation even. And I suspect that once I reach the younger generation, there's going to be a lot of glitter and a lot of dance music and a lot more of that, because your generation actually is much better at these conversations than ours. So I'm looking forward to it. I mean, I don't really have a great repertoire yet because I'm really pioneering this field, because I feel that if funerals are going out of fashion, we need to do something else. There is so much stuff in your culture about death right now. If you think about it, and you think about what you're listening to, what you're watching, you will be hearing conversations about death all the time. I think there is an understanding that British people don't like talking about emotions. We don't really like that stuff. We're not, where the Americans will have it all out. We are quite reserved in that way. But that is changing quite dramatically with your generation and younger. So you've got Gen Z, Gen Y, millennials. All of you guys are really good at this, and you're doing counselling and you're doing talking therapies, and you're on to people like me and your parents and saying you're just hopeless. You don't talk about your emotions. Like, we think we're much better because we're much better than our parents were before us. Yes, in our culture, in white British culture, it's endemic that we are known for being reserved with our emotions. That's true. But obviously, if you talk about British culture now, you're talking about huge diversity. And within those cultures, there are some cultures who are really, really great at talking about death. So I have hesitations around the idea of what British culture looks like now and the stereotype and the kind of understanding of what British culture is. So I think you have to start from, who do we mean? I'm going to assume that you're talking about kind of traditional white British stodgy culture like mine. And it is true that we're a bit rubbish at it. But obviously, if we have a beer, we're not rubbish at it. So it all comes out somehow. If you think about talking about death in that context, we're sort of no worse at talking about death than we are about talking about divorce or anything else in between. We're just not perhaps that good at talking about anything in a very honest way unless we're drunk. It's not true that there's no desire. It might be the case that there's no really safe context in which to do that, and we sort of leave that for therapy rooms if we ever go to them. What I do think is definitely the case is that we struggle to talk about the reality of dying. Those conversations, I think, don't happen, and I think it's to do with positivity and toxic positivity, mindset stuff. Like, if you have a positive mental attitude, you won't die, kind of thing. So if we talk about it, we're tempting fate. We're giving up hope. You're not being hopeful. Where what we're actually doing is being realistic and truthful. I'm going to start with a conversation that I had with an undertaker I worked with in Birmingham. They're called A Natural Undertaking, and they're amazing. I remember someone asking Carrie from there, "What do you want for your funeral?" And bear in mind that she'd arranged a decade worth of funerals. And she said, "I don't care because I won't be there." And her thing was, that's for other people to decide. I'm not here to control what happens to me after I die. That's one approach. And I feel like that's a really healthy approach. However, if the people who are grieving for you when you've died have not really the headspace or the emotional strength in that moment to make decisions on your behalf or make decisions about their own healing, then they might be kind of railroaded into something that doesn't feel at all accurate or comfortable or representative of you as a person. And so in those cases, I feel like there is a bit of not a should or an ought, but it is a really helpful thing for the people who are mourning for you when you're dead. And it is true that for the most part, people don't write down what they want or where they want it. And then you're left, I'm going to argue that you're a parent and your children are left behind and they don't really know where to start. And then you might end up with a ham sandwich at the creme, which I don't think you really want. So, no shoulds and no oughts, but it can be really helpful for the people who are picking up the pieces when you've gone. I had some really early brushes with death in my young life. I have epilepsy and I had a few really bad seizures that nearly killed me. And I didn't expect to live to 40. So I've never been afraid of it. I went to work in a hospice when I was 25. I've had multiple bereavements in my family. And then for a very long time, I had a very strong faith that I believed that there was something afterwards. So I don't think I've ever really... I even wonder whether I've ended up doing the work because I didn't have an issue with it in the first place. I'm not sure it has changed me, actually. It might have changed the way I look at how other people experience death. And it does change your attitude to life because it makes you realise that you're part of this incredible picture and this fantastic thing called human beings and human life. I think working with human beings and hearing their stories has made me really keen to live my own story and not let anybody else write my story for me. That was a COVID situation. I did a him sandwich, but obviously in style, at the Creme, and it was bleak and it was cold and it was COVID at its worst, you know, lockdowns and misery. And he died very early, really. He died in his, I think, late 50s. Oh no, early 50s. Horrible diagnosis, very quick, awful. He and his husband-to-be had been together throughout all the eras of it not being possible to talk about it. And they were, I think, together for 30 odd years. And they didn't really tell anyone. And then they finally came out. And then they decided they wanted, as by then, you know, middle-aged men, they wanted to get married. They set their wedding up. This was all before he was diagnosed, I should say. Set the wedding up, drag artist, curry buffet, entertainment, balloons, everyone booked, everything ready to go, the venue, all organised. And then Keith was diagnosed and died really suddenly. And then a few weeks later, Jerry, Keith's husband, Keith is the one that died, called me and said, I'm going ahead with the wedding. It's all booked. I don't want to let down any of the suppliers. And we've got a drag act that we loved. And we are having the wedding, even though he's not here. I know it sounds bizarre. I know it does. But I went and I was invited to read the eulogy from the stage at the front before the drag act. And I did. And all the people were a bit nervous about coming, but they came and they listened very attentively, very respectfully. And then they opened the champagne and then the drag artist hit the floor. And it was the most incredible celebration and just a beautiful, beautiful evening. So that's something that can happen with a celebrant. The best part of my job is listening to the stories of people's lives and making sure that they are accurately interpreted and heard. That's my favourite thing in the world. I love to give people one last round of applause. That's what I'm for. I love to cheerlead a person in life and I love to cheerlead a person in death. The worst part of my job is when a mother, it's usually a mother, calls me and their 17-year-old child has taken their own life by hanging and they are absolutely devastated, no one saw it coming. Those kinds of deaths of despair, I think I've reached capacity because I tend to get the young people and a lot of young people die by suicide. So, and I use that word reluctantly, but it is the word that we use in our culture. So that's the worst part of my job, listening to a mother telling me that happened. Celebrants in general earn very little money and we don't have enough money for professional supervision. And I haven't had any professional supervision for when I've been doing these funerals. And that's really unhealthy. I did get to a point where I thought I learned about something called vicarious trauma, which is something where you are traumatized by other people's trauma. And if you're not in a supervisory no one's supervising you in a professional capacity. Like if you were a psychiatrist, you would have a supervisor. It can happen. And I think I have suffered from vicarious trauma in the past. I only found out about it because I'm part of this festival that I work with. And I heard a speaker talking about it. And it's where you sort of can't, you just can't do it. It's too much. So I'm not doing so many of those. I think there is a limit to how many you should do. There are celebrants out there who do 5 ceremonies a day, 5 days a week, and I think they have a different approach to me. and that's perfectly legitimate. It can be very tiring, and you do have to, I think celebrants need to watch out for it. I think we need to sit down with our own feelings and process them, and not pretend that we're completely unaffected, because I don't think that would be very human.